Welcome. Thanks for coming today. Today's session is MGT 307, Becoming a Windows Intune IT Administrator, a Real-World Perspective. My name's Harris Schneiderman. I'm a technology strategist based in Melbourne. I work for Microsoft. Started my career in the US, and I moved to Australia about 2 years ago. This is my second TechEd New Zealand. I had a great time last time, so thank you very much for having me back again. A lot of that is based on feedback, so please fill out your evals, and I appreciate any and all feedback, good and bad, because it's really important, and I want to make sure this is a valuable session for you. Just to give you some context to make sure you're in the right room, this is the second session we have on Intune at TechEd, which is really great, actually, because a year ago at TechEd, there was one session on Intune, and it was in a very tiny room. It had about 20 or 30 people, which was great, and I think a lot of people had never heard of Intune at that point. And this year, we've got two sessions, and they were in really big rooms, and we've got great attendance, so that's really, really fantastic. Just a quick show of hands. Did anyone go to John Pritchard's session yesterday on Intune? Okay, that's fantastic. That's good. So I've made the assumption that you've gone to that session, and I'm not going to try to recover any of that ground, so you're not bored. I want to teach you new things today. So if you didn't go to that session and you feel a little bit lost or you want some more detail, I encourage you to go and watch that after this session. I think you'll find that very useful. But with that, let's get started. Okay, so I'm going to try to do three things today, given the time that we have. First of all, I want to teach you how to manage a Windows Intune tenant if you're an IT pro and you're managing a set of devices for your own company, or if you're a Microsoft partner and you're managing on behalf of someone else. I think this session will be relevant in both scenarios. Second thing I want to show you how to do is how to troubleshoot problems which arise in a real-world environment that you're managing with Windows Intune. So today for the demo, and there will be a lot of demos today, what I'm going to do is actually show you a live environment. So they're not demo machines that are sitting in a closet. They're actually real machines that I'm managing, and they will have various problems, I'm sure. That's part of the fun. And I'll show you some of those things that they come up, and I'll give you some strategies to address those issues. Curious, how many people are actually running a real production tenant today? Anyone? Okay, we've got a few people. How many people would like to? All right, good. Well, I'm hoping after today you'll have a little bit more confidence to do that, and I'll help you get started. And then towards the end, I will do a bunch of demos on Intune as time permits to show you some cool things. If there's things you'd like to see, feel free to raise your hand, and I'll do my best to accommodate you. I've got two different environments, so hopefully between the two of them, I'll be able to show you anything that you like. And if you want afterwards, you can come up, or we can chat over lunch. That would be fine, too. All right, so how I got started with Intune. My interest started when we released the product, and I read about it. It sounded really interesting, and I thought, I really want to be able to show this off to customers. And I'm one of those people, when I want to demo something and help customers understand it, the best way for me to do that is to actually use it. I don't want to read the marketing bullets and things like that. I want to actually use it and get my hands dirty and see what it can do. And what I found out was that Microsoft offered this option for a trial tenant. So I could get a free trial and run Intune. So I went and I set that up. I'll show you how to do that today if you've never set up a trial before. And then, I set that up. It felt really good. And then I realized that the trial that Microsoft gives you is actually very generous. It gives you up to 25 licenses that you can run, which is great. And then I said, I don't have 25 devices at home. I wish I did, but I don't. So what I decided to do was offer free device management for friends and family. So I'm using my Intune trial tenant to deliver management to friends and family. So that's one of the scenarios that I'll show you today. That's not really an intended use of Intune, but it's a great way to practice with it and get your hands dirty and understand what it can do, and then you can do it in a real production environment. And I've been running a true production tenant for over a year now, so I started, actually it's been a little bit more than a year because I started last year before TechEd. All right. So how would you set up a tenant? To start, whether you want to do a trial or a production, you'd go to our website, windowsintune.com. There's an option for a free 30-day trial. You'll sign in with your org ID. So for those of you who've used Intune before, you may remember that previous versions of Intune used a live ID, which is primarily intended as a consumer identity service. In the current release of Windows Intune, we've switched over to using org ID, which is the same ID that you might use if you have an Office 365 tenant. So that's really useful because if you already have an Office 365 tenant, and some of you may, then you can use the same org ID, which is great. If you don't, you can sign up and get one. And then you have to put in some details, and you'll get an email confirmation. So let me show you very quickly how you would do that. So obviously, I already have a tenant, but I'll flip over here. So you go to our website. That's the easy URL to remember. It redirects you to a longer one, but I find that short one simpler. And you can see, just in case you get lost, there's 3 different ways to sign up for a trial. You got it here, you got it here, and you got it here. So lots of different options, just in case you missed it. And what you can see here is that you've got the 30-day trial option, big green button, and you also have the right, if you want to, you can actually buy a subscription, and you can see the retail price right there. And it's per PC per month. But one thing to keep in mind with that is if your primary device is licensed for Intune, you get up to 4 complementary devices in which you're the primary user at no additional charge. So if you do the math on that, it's actually only a little over 2 devices per $2 per device per month. So you can go here, you can click on the 30-day trial, and it'll sign you in with your live ID. I won't go that far because obviously I have a tenant, so it's not necessary, but that gives you an idea of what you can do. And the other thing I'll show you, just to go back very quickly, is it shows you what the requirements are right here on the right-hand side. So what do you need to do before you sign up? And there's various things like, what are the client software requirements? What is Windows Intune supported on? You can see that here, and it lists all those things: hardware, memory, permissions, updates, supported web browsers, how the deployment works. So you can read all of that before you get started so you don't run into any problems. And then, of course, it says that you need an Office 365 ID or an org ID. Windows Live IDs cannot be used to sign up for a trial, so don't try that. You used to be able to do it, and you can't. So just keep that in mind. All right. Now, once you get your tenant set up and provisioned, when you get in there, you'll notice that it will be empty. There won't be any devices in there. That is the next step. You have to provision them. I'll warn you up front, this is one of the most time-intensive parts of setting up Intune, is getting clients in there. The reason for that is because Windows Intune does not have a mechanism to deploy its own client. So for those of you who have experience with Config Manager, Config Manager has a discovery method, and you can do some of those things. The challenge is that Intune is a very different product when it comes to discovery and deployment. And that's because there's a lot of assumptions you can make in Config Manager that you can't make with Intune. So Intune does not assume that you're a member of a domain, so there may not be a computer object for you to enumerate. It does not assume that you're on the same network. It does not assume that there isn't a firewall in between you. And it doesn't assume that you have any sort of, you, the administrator, have any rights or permissions or privileges on that machine. So doing automatic discovery and deployment is very challenging. But there are a number of different deployment options that you can use. This is not an exhaustive list by any means. But first of all, you can go and manually deploy it. You can go to the PC, you can download the software, you can double-click and run it. That's great if you're doing a few. There are some you may have to do that on, but that's really not the best way. If you have domain-joined machines, you can deploy via group policy object if you have that provision available. If you have a deployment tool of choice that already has an agent on your machine, you can use that tool. So you can use Config Manager or some other tool. But in some cases, none of those methods are really viable. You may not even be physically near the PC, so even manual deployment may not be a good approach. The scenario that I think is the most challenging is one that John talked about yesterday in his session, which is the BYO session. So someone brings their device and says, I want to have this device be usable at work, and IT says, well, okay, that's fine, but we need to do some basic management and security of it using Intune. It's a great scenario. But IT doesn't own that device. IT has no rights and privileges on it. So the way to deploy it there, or the best way, I think, is a self-service deployment. You make it easy for the end user to deploy themselves. And one of the ways I've done that is I just basically set up kind of an email, and it has a link to documentation. Here's what you have to do. Here's a link to download. And I make that client available in a secure hosted location like a SkyDrive or a SkyDrive Pro, something like that. Those are great ways. And then the user can decide, if I want to bring my device to work and I want to be connected to the organization and access resources, I need to load this piece of software. And then at that point, Intune can take over and I can manage it in an automated way. So the reality is when you deploy Intune in your organization, you may have to use a combination of all 4 of these methods and perhaps some others as well, because depending upon the scenario, different ones will make sense. The other thing you want to think about before you deploy anything is your anti-malware strategy. Windows Intune has a built-in anti-malware component called Windows Intune Endpoint Protection. It's built on the same platform as System Center Endpoint Protection and Microsoft Security Essentials, so they have the same capability in terms of detection. But it's more like System Center Endpoint in that it's centrally manageable and configurable, and it has alerting and it has policies, whereas MSE does not. But the difference is, unlike System Center Endpoint Protection, Windows Intune Endpoint Protection requires no infrastructure. It's entirely cloud-based. All it does is load a piece of client software on your machine, which is managed centrally via the Intune console. So if, again, corporate environment, usually you have a standardized anti-malware solution. That's usually not too challenging. When it comes to BYO, you can get all manner of solutions. You'll have some people that will have absolutely no anti-malware protection, and their computer will be in an absolutely shocking state. I can guarantee you that. You will have some people who bring in and say, oh, I've downloaded this free thing from the internet. I've been using that for my anti-malware. And so then you've got to work out, should my policy be that I want to standardize and say, no, if you want to come to our organization and access resources, we need a centrally managed and controlled solution. You have to use Windows Intune Endpoint Protection. I highly recommend that. Or if you take a lighter approach, you may say, well, as long as you have some valid anti-malware product on the system, I'm okay with that. I recommend you use Windows Intune Endpoint Protection for 2 reasons. Number one, it is a very, very low footprint. It uses a low amount of memory and CPU. It's very fast. It's a lightweight product. A lot of my users, when I deployed Intune to their system, about a week later called me and said, I don't know what Intune does, but it's made my computer really fast. And I found that kind of funny because Intune didn't actually do anything to their computer. All it did was remove their anti-malware solution, and it made their computer faster. So that was really good. And that is a nice side benefit. But the second benefit from an IT admin point of view is that now I can centrally manage their AV solution from the same console that I use to do everything else with Intune. So I can know if they've scanned, if they've updated, if they've had viruses. I know who my frequent offenders are, who download things that they shouldn't, and all that kind of great stuff. So I find that is very valuable, so I do whatever I can. If I can force them to use Windows Intune Endpoint Protection, I do. If I can't force them, I strongly encourage them. Now, one of the things you got to think about, if they already have an anti-malware product on their system, the good news is that Intune can remove a number of different products, and the list is right here, and there's a link if you like, you can download that. So if they've got that, especially if you're an organization that was previously using System Center and Forefront, and you want to do that nice seamless transition, you can do that in one operation. Intune will remove the product and install itself. So that's really great. So if you've got machines on this list, that'll be a really easy process. If you don't, you want to really think about what's going to happen if you try to put Intune on a machine where it can't remove the other solution. I've tested this many times, sometimes deliberately, sometimes accidentally. And what I found is more often than not what will happen is Intune will deploy, all of its agents will turn on, but the endpoint protection won't because it'll detect there's another program and it'll disable itself. So that's not a catastrophe, but it's also not great because then you won't get any management insight from there. So my recommendation is if they have a product that's not on this list, already on the machine, you need to get them to remove it before you deploy Intune. So I actually put that in my provisioning instructions. Yes. Yeah, that's the complete list. Again, it's referenced in the help. Yeah, so it's not, as you can see, there are hundreds of anti-malware products on the market. You're not going to be able to remove all of them. Some of them are going to need to be manually removed. And again, if I don't have control over your system prior to deploying Intune, the only person that can remove it is you. So I make that a requirement. I say, please remove this, and then run the Intune installation. And again, if they don't, it's not going to be a catastrophe, but you'll just have to go and remote in and uninstall it and then reinstall Intune. All right. So let me show you how deployment works. Go back to this. Close that, close that. So if you go down into the administration node in Intune, there's a little link here for client software download. And what's really nice is on this menu, it gives you step-by-step instructions on how to do this. So if you forget everything I told you today, you can go here and you can say, OK, I need to get prepared. What are the requirements? You can click that link. Then you can download the client software. Now, what's nice is it reminds you here how many licenses you actually have. Because I'm in the trial, I have 25. It tells me that I have 2 remaining. If I had 0 remaining and I try to deploy the Intune client on my 26th device, what will happen is the install will fail because it'll check in with the service and say, you don't have an available license, and it'll roll back the install. So this prevents you from wasting a lot of time if you don't have an available license. So you click here, you'll download the software, it'll open a window, it'll download this file, and click Save As, and you'll see it there. I've already downloaded it just to save time. But essentially what it does is it downloads a zip file, and then inside that zip file, there's an exe, which actually does the installation. You can see it's not very large. And then there's a certificate file. That certificate file is what tells the installer which tenant to pair you to. So that certificate gives the client the right to connect to my tenant. So I want to make sure I secure that file, because if I let that get out in the world, then what that means is that anyone and their cousin will be able to jump into my tenant, and I don't want that. So that's not a good thing. So you want to protect that. That can be tricky when you do self-service deployment, because they've got to get that file in order to install it. So you want to really think that through carefully. If I'm doing a central deployment, it's much easier because then I can control it and I can clean up afterwards and all that good stuff. So you'll download that. You'll figure out your deployment method of choice, whatever that is from my original list or some other item, and then you'll run that thing and it'll install. First it installs a small agent, and then that agent will go out to the cloud and it'll download all the different pieces of Intune that I've enabled. So it'll get the anti-malware engine, it'll get the inventory engine, it'll get the monitoring engine, and all those different pieces. Okay. Now, so you set up your tenant, you provision it with clients, and then now the fun part begins. Now you can actually do some real work. So what I did was I sort of made a list of the top things that I do on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, the regular things that I do, care and feeding of Windows Intune. Okay? Your list may differ if you run this, so I'm curious for those of you who are running a tenant, if you have different things that you'd add here. There's always things I could say, but these are kind of the top 5. If you do these things, I think you're doing a good job. So number 1, this is a big one. You have to deal with machines which are offline or not communicating properly. I think it's fairly obvious to most people in IT, but not necessarily to end users, that Windows Intune is a cloud service, and that means the machine needs to have a connection to the internet, and it needs to be contactable on port 80 and 443. End users don't care about those things, but if their machine is turned off, or it's not on the internet, or they mess with their firewall settings, or they do something silly, Intune is not going to be able to monitor and manage and do the things that I want, and it will actually throw an error. And I'll show you that. It'll say, I can't contact this machine, and I don't know what's going on. So that's really the number 1 headache that I have, especially with mobile devices, which get turned off, they roam, they're not connected. That's going to be the number 1 thing that's going to get in the way of you achieving your objective, which is keeping that device secure and monitoring it. But the good news is, again, Intune tells you, so you know when you have a problem. The second thing I do on a regular basis is I look for security warnings related to the endpoint protection module, so I found a virus or something like that, and also failed updates. So I'm trying to keep machines patched. Patch Tuesday, patches come out, I try to push them out, get them deployed. If something fails in that process, I need to know about it. Now, if you want to be a really successful Intune administrator, my recommendation is to take advantage of automation wherever possible. Intune can do a lot of things for you in an automated way. So the more you set up automation, the less manual work you're going to have, and that's a good thing. It'll save you time, and you'll deliver a good service without actually doing anything. So what you want to do here is manage by exception. I have the anti-malware piece automated. I have patching automated. It's all automated. I only get involved if something breaks, and hopefully that's very rarely, and therefore I don't have to do a whole lot. The third thing I do is I check for alerts and warnings which require certain follow-up. One of the really great things about Intune is that it has a built-in monitoring capability. So a lot of people, if you're familiar with System Center, they think, well, Intune's kind of roughly equivalent to Config Manager. There are some differences, obviously. But the truth is that Intune actually does some things that Config Manager can't do, and one of them is it actually has a basic monitoring capability built in, which is more like Ops Manager. And in fact, if you look at a client where you deploy Intune, it actually has the Ops Manager agent, monitoring agent running on it. And that means that I can get some basic alerting and warnings when things go wrong, which is great. I don't have to go to another console. I don't have to run another tool. It's all built in. I can see it right there in the front. I'll show you that in a moment. And so that gives me notifications that I need to follow up and do something. And again, because I want to try to do as much automation as possible, I don't want to check the console every 10 minutes for problems. I want it to notify me, generally via email, that something's gone wrong. So I have it set up. If there's a critical alert, it sends me an email. I know something's wrong. I can get involved and fix it. Now, the fourth thing that I do often is I deploy a lot of software with Intune. Since version 2, the previous version, and the current version as well, we have a mechanism to deploy software. I'm going to spend a lot of time on that today. But essentially, what I'm doing is I'm trying to keep that end user software up to date. Now, I don't do everything, right? If it's a personal machine, I don't worry about their iTunes, and I don't worry about their games and things like that. But there are certain things that I want to make sure I keep up to date that have nothing to do with Windows. So what I found was, initially when I started this, before we had software deployment, I was patching their OS, and I was keeping it up to date, and I was checking for viruses, and I was doing all these good things. And what I found was that people were still having issues. They were still getting infected. I said, well, why is that? And the reason for that is because they were running a version of Java that was 3 years old, and they had Adobe Reader that was 3 years old, and all this stuff, and they had hundreds of vulnerabilities. So I think my opinion is that you can't really do a great job protecting those end client computers if you're securing the OS, but you're leaving everything else wide open, and it's got known problems. So just this past week, some of you may know there was a critical vulnerability in Java, right? And so I think a good administrator would go out and make sure that thing got updated so that I know people were patched. So I spend a lot of time keeping that up to date and then monitoring it and making sure that everyone's at a level that I feel comfortable with. And there's a great reporting engine in Intune, so I can run a report and see if everyone's up to the level that I want. And then the fifth thing that I do a lot is I modify the Intune policies so to keep my administrative burden low, and to also improve the end user experience. So the way to think of policies is they're similar to group policies, but they have no reliance on or connection to a domain. And that's great. If I have a lot of machines that are not domain joined, I can still do some very basic policy things on those machines. If the machine is domain joined, I have a choice. I can use Intune policies, or I can use GPOs. You don't want to have two policies from two different sources doing conflicting things. So you've got to make a choice at some point. I like to use Intune policies because they work across any machine that's managed with Intune. They don't have to be domain joined, and I can monitor them all from one central place. I'll show you that in a bit. But the reason that I use policies is because it saves me time. I know how I want a machine to behave. I set a policy once, I push it out, and then the machine always does that. If the user goes and makes changes, as they do, often if it's their machine, they're the administrator, so they can change whatever they want. But if I have a policy, I can put it right back. Now, one of the interesting things that I deal with a lot, because I get a lot of feedback from end users on this, is the behavior around patching, right? So I've got some users, there's a whole spectrum of opinions. Everyone has an opinion. So one spectrum of users says, don't tell me when I have to patch. It's my machine. I don't want to be interrupted. I don't want it to bother me when I'm working. It needs to happen in the evening or on the weekend when I won't be disturbed. And that's fine. You can schedule your patches to go at the time that makes sense for your end user. I have other end users who say, I don't like the pop-ups. Don't nag me. Just patch the thing. Don't nag me 17 times. Just put the patch on and move on. And they want it to be really quiet and non-intrusive, and that's fine too. And you can create a different experience for those two different sets of users in the same tenant. So that way, everyone can be happy. So it's the best of both worlds. Let me show you what I mean. I'll show you a couple of those scenarios in action. Okay, so when you launch Intune, let's refresh. What you'll see is that in the system overview pane, you get a little section for each of the agents that is deployed on every one of my managed devices. So I told you about the number one thing that'll get you is systems that are offline. Notice I get a notification here. I've got 3 computers which are offline. I click on that. It drills into the node here for machines, and I can see the 3 computers in my environment which are offline, and I can see exactly how long they were offline. So right here, I've got Bob's computer. Bob was last online on the 26th of August. So I can't do it. I haven't done anything. It hasn't reported in since then. Probably Bob's machine's turned off. So the good thing is I now have the data to know that. I'm notified, and I can actually, I can call or email Bob and say, Bob, you got to turn your computer back on. Oh, sorry about that. Or he'll say, oh, I've been on vacation. I'm sorry, my machine's at my desk. Okay, that's fine. When you get back, please turn it back on, and then I can actually do something to it. And then it'll also give you notifications. So you see here, it looks like Bob's machine's doing all right, but what it'll tell you is, computer hasn't contacted us for a while, so this is stale data. So you may not want to, bet your career on the fact that his machine's okay, because we just don't know. So that way you know, what's the level of confidence we have on that, which is very helpful. Now, the second thing I talked about was malware. And you can see in the endpoint protection module, it's green, so I'm in a pretty good state. Things are going well. But I did have an incident recently, and Intune keeps your malware history. You can configure how far back it goes in terms of its memory for those issues. But I can see here, there was a machine, it had some malware. The last time it was detected was 4 days ago. And they're resolved, which is good. I had 2 instances of malware. And I can get some details on it. So I can see that, these were the 2 exploits on the machine. I can see the number of times that it was detected. I can see when it was detected. I can see what happened. I blocked execution, and I removed it. So that's good. Now, Intune did this all for me. I didn't do anything. It found an infection, and it cleaned it, and then it notified me and said, I did my job, everything's good. So it was a serious issue, but Intune did its job and cleaned it up, which is good. Now, after the fact, I may want to go back and find out a little bit about this malware. You can kind of tell from the name, if you're familiar with our naming convention, it was a Java-based exploit, it's a critical vulnerability, and it's got a number. But other than that, I can't really tell much. But if I click on it and I hit that button, it'll go directly to the Malware Protection Center, and I can read more about it. So, and some have a lot of info and some don't, but I can see, for example, which version of the signature protects against that infection. When did Microsoft have it reported? What does it do? How does it infect the machine, and all those sorts of things. So I see various trends. And this is one of the ways I learned about how viruses get into these machines. I can kind of go back and look and read about them and say, well, it's caused by going to a malicious website. So I can say, hey, Mr. User, please don't go to that website. Please don't download those illegal movies, because that's why you're getting viruses. That usually goes down all right. If you do a really good job, then they'll go, oh, I can do anything, because Intune's protecting me, so I'm invincible. And you say, no, you're not invincible. Here's some issues with updates. I've got a couple update-related errors. And you can see this is really useful, because I'll show you an example here. This is an old HP that I'm managing, and it's got 3 failed updates. And if you drill in there, I can see that, oh, these are security updates related to Office 2003. So some really old stuff, but it'll tell me exactly which patch is missing, what the KB article was that it's referenced, and there's a specific error involved. There's an error code. If I want to, and I click here, it takes me directly to Bing, and it does a search on that exact error, so I can see how do I resolve it. So that's always my starting point for, I've got a big red X, what do I do about that? It takes me directly to a search engine, and it shows me how to, what causes that error. So that's a great way to start your troubleshooting process. Now, we also talked a little bit about software installation. I will spend a lot of time on this today, but I'll show you very quickly. You can see in the console, we've got software install errors, multiple computers. I can drill in there. It shows me the computers, what's failed, and what's going on. Let's pick on my brother. So this is my brother's machine, and he's got a software install that's failed. And oh, look, it's that Java thing that I needed to push out. So my brother, being the irresponsible man that he is not protected. There's something going on there. So we need to look at that, but again, I get the error code. I can take that code, put it in my search engine, figure out what that means. So I'm getting a lot of really good data out of the system to help me troubleshoot. All right, now the last thing I'll show you that I talked about is policies. So again, policies, really important. I get some good data here. I've got one device that is in an error state. So what exactly does that mean? I can drill in. I can find the machine. This is actually a netbook. And I can click here, and it'll show me exactly which policy settings are in error. So what this is doing, think of this like desired configuration management in Configuration Manager. I have a policy objective, so I have a set of policies that I want to set on the machine. So Intune pushes those policies to the machine, and then it monitors the state of the machine and reports back if there are any differences between what it's trying to do and what actually happens. So in this case, I'm setting dozens and dozens of policies, but 13 of them, for some reason, are not coming back correctly. So Intune is unable to set the setting to the way that I intend for some reason, and therefore it's reporting back an error. And again, just like before, it gives me an error code. So in this case, first of all, I want to figure out what's the policy that's in error. Well, I'm deploying a policy to the machine's firewall to lock it down, to disable ports, so that if the users open up all their ports, I can lock them down. And then, so you can see you've got two columns, the intended value, which is disabled, I want to disable it, and the reported value, which is blank, which means Intune cannot read and verify the state of the firewall, so it reports an error, as it should. And again, I don't know what that is, but I can look it up. There's a hex code, and I can go to troubleshooting and find out what's gone wrong. So you see kind of a consistent theme throughout. Intune does a lot of stuff in an automated way. If it's not successful for some reason, it gives me a clear notification, it gives me an alert, and it gives me an error code. So I can start my troubleshooting from there. That's correct. It doesn't. That's a great question. So does it only work with Intune's policy? The answer is yes. If I'm doing this with a group policy, I won't get the data in here because I'm not monitoring group policy and Intune is not setting group policy. So that's a good reason why I recommend you use Intune's policy setting. Now, on that topic, though, that's a good segue. I also can see if I have policies which conflict with group policy. And you can see that there. I have some machines where I'm setting a group policy to do one thing, and then I'm setting Intune policy to do another thing, and of course, they conflict. So Intune can deal with that. It just says, oh, well, I can't do what I want, but it lets you know, and then you need to go back and figure out why do you have a conflict and try to resolve it. One other thing I'll show you in the interface while I'm here is it's got this great summary pane. I don't know if you've seen this. I find this very useful. It kind of breaks down your organization by how many desktops and laptops do I have, what manufacturers are they, what operating systems am I running, and my favorite, disk space usage. So I can see I've got one user that's got over 90% disk space usage, which is a problem, obviously, and I might want to notify them and have them clean up their disk. Okay. So that's a little of the day-to-day management. Now I want to spend more time on deploying software, because this is by far my favorite feature. So one of the things that I think is a surprise to a lot of people if they haven't used Intune before is that software deployment is not about deploying Microsoft software. It's about deploying software full stop. You can deploy anything with Intune as long as it meets two criteria. Okay? Number one, it must be packaged software as an EXE or an MSI. Okay? So if you want to deploy a script, which is fine, you can do that, you have to package it. Okay? That's number one. Number two, the package must be able to install silently. So if I want to deploy software to a machine, which is done independent of the logged on user, it needs to deploy silently, obviously, because the user is not going to be there to click the button and say OK. Intune, when you deploy to a system, actually deploys it in the system context. And that's great, because it means I don't need to worry about the privileges of the user. So that user may not be an admin, or they might not be there, or whatever. Or they might want to try to cancel it. But if I want to deploy something to them, I can do it independent of them. And if, as you know, if you deploy a system, they're not even going to see it happen. It's going to occur in the background, and magically the software will appear. They won't know where it came from. So that's a great feature. I never have permissions issues, which is wonderful. But it does mean that your installer must be silent. If, by default, your installer is not silent, it must have a switch to make it silent, like a /Q or /quiet. So I'll show you where you set that up. We'll do a little demo in a minute, and I'll show you where you set that. OK, so you've got to upload the software, make sure that it's going to work, upload the software, and then, just to be careful, you should test it. And the way you test it, or my best practice for testing, is you actually create a group in Intune called your test group. Okay? I am a big believer in using yourself as the guinea pig for the sake of science, so I'm always in my own test group. So I test software on my machine first, and if it doesn't break it, and a few others that are representative, then I know it's OK. So I create a test group. I push the package to that test group, make sure it installs, make sure everything's fine, and then if it's all good, then I deploy it to production. So just to be clear, this is doing testing within the same tenant. I'm using groups in the same tenant for doing testing. If you want to test outside of your tenant, you have to have a secondary tenant. And some people do that. But there's no connection between the two. So you'd have to upload the software twice. So I find testing within the same tenant works fine as long as you have clear test cases. So you test it, deploy it to production, and then you can actually specify the deployment schedule. So that goes back to what we discussed earlier about when do my end users want to be impacted. Now, if you're deploying to their machine silently, and it doesn't require reboot, in theory, you can do that at any point, right? Unless what you're deploying is upgrading a program that they're using currently, then you may not want to do it while they're on the machine. You may want to do it in the evening or on the weekend. But again, their machine's got to be on, so you got to balance those things. But you can determine the schedule to deploy the software, and then you can monitor it to make sure the deployment has succeeded and see if you got errors. You saw before, if I get an error, if the install fails, I'll get a notification, and I'll know something went wrong. All right, let me show you how to do it. I chose for this demo deploying Skype. Choose any product. Skype's just a cool example because a lot of people use it, and I thought it was a good one. So if you go to my software node, you look here, these are the software packages that I've chosen to deploy in my environment. There are many that you could choose, certainly. One of the things I did to work out, well, what software should I really be managing for users, was I used the reporting module in Intune to figure out what were they running. So I deployed the Intune agent. It used its inventory collection to tell me what's on their systems, and then I figured out what's really common. And big surprise, a lot of people have Flash Player, a lot of people have Java, and a lot of people have Skype. So those were some of the ones that I chose. And you can see I've already got Skype uploaded here, but what I'll do just for the sake of the demo is I'll take you through the process of how did I get to that, so it's a little bit like a cooking show. So what you do is you click Add Software. It's going to open a window. And what it's going to do is launch a little application called the Windows Intune Software Publisher. Now what you'll notice is before it launches it, it's going to ask me to sign in. Now the reason it does that is because this is basically, I can deploy anything to anyone's system, so it wants to verify that I am actually a legitimate administrator, which is, I think, a good feature. This is my fictitious company. So you sign in, and what you'll notice is that this looks a lot like the software tool that you'd have in Config Manager, except it's all running as a cloud-based service. So it's wizard-driven. It's very simple. Gives you instructions on what to do. You get a choice. What kind of software do I want to deploy? In this release of Intune, I can do Windows PC-based software, x86 or x64, or I can do Android or iOS applications that I have packaged for deployment. This is very, I think, popular for, I want to deploy some sort of line of business software to my end users that's outside of the general store for consumer software. But in this case, Skype will do the Windows version at the moment. To save time, I've already downloaded the package. OK, now, if you go to Skype.com and you download the installer, you'll get this one, the executable. I am going to choose the MSI. I will not tell you at the moment how I got that MSI, but I highly recommend you use it. If you're interested, we can have a discussion on that later. So I'm going to put in a little bit of metadata here. Who's the publisher? You can put the URL. And I can even categorize it. I'll show you in a minute why that's useful. I'll say it's a collaborative app. Click Next. Now I need to specify the requirements. So what can this version of the software actually run on? In this case, it'll work on both 32 and 64-bit systems. And it will run on anything from XP to Windows 7. Now you'll notice there isn't an option for Windows 8 there yet. That is coming. But for right now, it's XP to Windows 7. This is where I put in command line arguments. So if I need to do a silent install, I click yes, and I do /Q or something like that. Next, and then I'd click upload. Now at this point, if I click upload, what it's going to do is it's going to compress the package, it's going to encrypt it, and it's going to upload it from my local machine into the cloud for distribution and put that in Azure Blob Storage. I'm going to cancel because we don't need to wait for that to happen since I've already done it. But if you look here, if I go back to the overview pane under software, what you'll see is my cloud storage status. So by default, when you sign up for Intune, you get 2 gigs of cloud storage for free. It's included with the trial. And it'll even tell you I've only used about 9%. If I start running out of space and I want to clean it up a little bit, you click Manage Storage, and what it'll show you is every package that you have in there and how much space it's taking up. So periodically, I go and I clean out old software that's no longer in use. I run the report. Oh, no one's using that software anymore. OK, well, I'll clean it up. And that way, you can keep your storage clean. If you want to go beyond the 2 gig limit, there's an additional fee you can pay to Microsoft, and you can add more storage. You can add another gig or another 2 gigs, whatever you want. All right, and then, before I do that, once I've got the software uploaded, then what I need to do is actually deploy it. Now, there's 2 ways that you can deploy software with this version of Intune, which is great. So the previous version, you can only do one, which was you deploy it to a machine silently. So you go here, Manage Deployment. OK, I chose Link. Oh, actually, you know what? Let's do Skype for now. I'll show you both. Now, Skype, what I'm doing is I'm deploying it to a group of devices that I call Skype computers. So I created a group. I put all the machines that I want to get Skype into that group, and then I say deploy that package to the group. So it's pretty straightforward. You pick a group, you click Add, you see it there. Click Next, and then I decide I'm going to make it a required install. That means install it, it's mandatory, they can't say no. And I pick a schedule. So as soon as possible, 1 week, 2 weeks, 1 month, custom, so I can decide how I want to deploy that. And then click Finish, and it'll start deploying. And then once it's deployed, what you can see when you hover over the thing, it tells me that 19 computers have the software installed. And it's green, so everything's been successful. And I can see the list. So that's a required install, which you deploy to a machine. Now, the other option is I can do what's called an available install, which is to a user. So I'll show you this with Link. So what I've done here is this is the Link client that comes with Office 365. So I use Intune, which is a great scenario, to actually deploy the software for Office 365, the Link client, the Office client, et cetera. That's a great scenario because they're both cloud services. They live together. So it's good to use Intune as your deployment tool. In this case, what I've done is I've created another group, and I call it Link Users. And what I've done, instead of putting machines in that group, I've put users in the group. This is an example of user-centric management. So I put the users in the group. I put the group and say I want to deploy Link to that group. And then when I go over here, instead of a required install, it's an available install. And what that means is that I make the software available for the user to install when they choose to, and it is not mandatory. So instead of me just deploying it silently to their machine, what I do is I put it out on a self-service portal, which I'll show you in a minute, and that user can go and click and say, I want that software, and it'll download and install. And that way, it's a great way to give them optional software that they may want, and I can customize it for them. So because I know their ID, their org ID in Office 365, and I know what groups they're a member of, I can say, oh, you're in the finance department, here's some finance apps. And oh, you're in marketing, here's some marketing apps. And for certain people, if they like games, I can give them some games. Maybe the CEO wants games, I can do that. So make it available. And here, when I make it available, the deadline's irrelevant because it's for them to get whenever they want. So I'll show you that in a minute. That's the admin experience to publish it there. And in my next demo, I'll show you what the end user experience is when they want to actually get it. It's a good question. If you deploy it to a user, there is no notification. It just appears on the portal. They have to go and check it. If you deploy it to their machine, I have the option of giving them a pop-up to say, I'm deploying something to you, or you need to reboot, something like that. So the notification per user is it appears on the portal, which is customized to them. lost my clicker. All right. So you're an Intune administrator now. Things are going great. Sometimes you have problems. It happens. The good news is there's a lot of great troubleshooting resources. So I left you a link here for the online help. Some great stuff in there, FAQ, forums to ask questions, videos, tutorials, the Tech Center, and if you get really into trouble, how do I contact Microsoft Support or CSS? Now, what I'll do, just to keep it interactive, I'll show you. Maybe I don't remember that link. I can't remember it. There's this great little help thing right here. It actually does something. You click on it, and it goes to a web page, and there you go. There's your help. And there's a lot of great stuff on here. The help for Windows Intune is really, really good. I almost always find my answer here when I get stuck. And you can see they keep it current. So this applies to the June release, which is the most recent. So it came out just a few months ago. It's very, very good. So I can walk through this. How do I do common tasks? How do I get ready? How do I deploy? Everything is documented there in very good detail. Even the error codes. You get a hex error. What does that mean? You can search on the site. You can see, sorry, I scrolled up. You can search Bing right here, and it'll search the Intune site. Now, if I really get into trouble and I have to open a support request, I can do that straight from the portal. And again, I've given you the link, but it goes right off the help link. So let's just kind of walk through that very quickly. If you want to open a support request, you click here. Opens another window. And I've got a couple options. One is, I want phone support. Click here. And look, you get how to open a support request via the phone. You scroll down, you find your country, New Zealand, hours, phone number, right there. If you're not really into talking to a human being, you want to do email, you can go here. You can get a web form. You can fill it out, pick your issue, write a blurb, and click Submit. I have found the support is very responsive. They generally get back to you the same business day. They're very fast. They even get back to me on weekends often, which is very nice. And the support is free, which is great. So you need help? Don't hesitate. Now, let's say you open a support request. Someone contacts you, phone or email, whatever the case may be. And they're going to need to get some diagnostic info. Now, if the problem is with your Intune tenant, that's on their end. They can control that. They usually do that without any data. You just tell them what the issue is, and they can work on it. More often than not, the problem is going to be with the end client, which obviously they don't control. So one of the things they'll have you do is collect some diagnostic data. And so what you do is you run a tool called MSDT, or the Microsoft Diagnostic Toolkit. And I'll show you that quickly. Let's close all these windows. If you've never run this before, you just do msdt.exe. CSS will provide you with a code, which you type in here. And that code says basically collect data from that system and then upload it to a location that's linked to your support case so they can take a look at it. It pulls logs, it pulls all kinds of configuration data, and then they can figure out what's wrong. So they'll say, oh, well, your machine's full of WMI errors. Maybe you have a WMI problem, or something like that. So you get those kind of issues will come up, and they can diagnose them for you. All right, so I showed you that. Last thing I'm going to show you today is the company portal. What does that self-service experience look like? So now I'm going to be an end user instead of an IT guy. So if you're the administrator and you can't remember what the portal is, you can go here to the administration node, click in a well-named company portal. This is the support information that you want to show to your end users. So I give them my name, phone number, email, that kind of stuff. And then you can click here, and it's portal.manage.microsoft.com. So every tenant has the same URL. Now, notice what happened there. It automatically signed me in because I'm already signed in with my org ID, so I had single sign-on. If I hadn't been signed in, the user would get prompted for their org ID, and they'd put it in. And that would ensure that the portal that they go to, even though the URL is the same, is actually customized for them. So it'll show the company that's managing them. There's my fake company. And when they go in here, they'll see, okay, how do I contact my IT guy? Okay, that's how I get in touch with Harris. That's great. And they can manage their own devices. So in this case, as Harris, I only have one device, but I could add additional devices. So maybe I buy another computer and I want to add it and provision it, or I get a phone or something like that. All those things I can do there. Or maybe I want to retire a device and remove it, and I can do that too. But the really cool thing is the apps. So these are the apps that my administrator has made available for me to install. So they're customized for me. So you can see that link client right here. If I click on that, it's going to open a window. And it's going to say, Harris has, in this case, one machine, but I could have up to 5. I could check that box and say, I want to deploy this client to every machine that I have. Click Install, and it'll deploy. So that way I get to decide when to push it out. And that, again, is great for a BYO scenario because the user can feel like they're in control, they're putting on the software that they want, and I'm not being too heavy-handed with them. So you got options. Okay. I've got about 10 minutes left. What I thought I'd do is just pause for questions. And then if we want to do questions, we can do that. If you want me to show a few more demos, I can do another 10 minutes of demos. But I thought I'd leave it kind of open at this point so we can make this exciting for you guys. So let me just take that. So anyone have a question? I've got one right here.
Have you ever used Windows to Go in real life?
Yes. So Windows to Go. And if you didn't see the session yesterday from Andrew McMurray, he's right over there. It was a really good session. The principle from that session that I learned was Windows to Go works just like regular Windows. So when Intune supports Windows 8, it will support Windows to Go. Okay? It doesn't support it yet because we don't support Windows 8, not because it's Windows to Go. The key thing there is, again, if my stick is out of the machine and my machine's turned off, Intune won't be able to manage anything, and that's fine. That's normal. It's just like a machine being turned off. But when that machine's on, connected to the internet, Windows to Go, I can manage it just like a regular system. So that's a great scenario for BYO. I can manage the host system with Intune, and I could manage the Windows to Go instance with Intune as well if I wanted to.
Can you identify this Windows to Go?
That's a good question. So since that isn't something that's fully supported, I don't know the answer to that yet. I have tried deploying Intune on a Windows 8 system, and I can tell you with confidence it doesn't quite work. So I'm going to park that one. Talk to me when we have our next release, and I'll tell you. On a partition. This is a question of Windows to Go or Windows Intune? Okay, can you install it on a partition? Well, the way it would work is you actually install Windows on a USB key. And so by default, when you do that, Andrew, I should get you up here for this. By default, when you do that, it disables access to the local drives. So partitions in that case don't really much matter. Do you mean like a partition in the USB key?
So you can have like a secure container almost on the actual laptop.
I suppose you could do that, but that really wouldn't be Windows to Go. That's a totally different scenario. Because the idea is that it's on removable storage. That's the intent. So, okay, how about we'll go over here. Microsoft Security Essentials, you mean? How does it? Oh, yeah, I understand. Okay, so you're asking, how does Intune work with Windows Server Essentials? The answer is Windows Intune is not supported on any server operating system, including Essentials. Well, the clients that are connected to it, if it's a supported client OS, absolutely. It'll work just fine. But it doesn't, you can't load and put the agent on a server. It's not supported. But clients that use an Essential server, absolutely. So if you got a small business with one server, Intune's a great management story. So I absolutely encourage you to do that. Gentleman in the back.
What can Intune do for an iOS and Android device in terms of managing it, deploying apps to it, monitoring it? Obviously, it's limited.
Great question. The question is, what can Intune do for Android and iOS? Let me show you. So what I'll do to demonstrate that, I actually have an environment which has got some provisioned. So let me log into that, and I will show you. So this is my second environment, and it's got a lot more machines in it, and it has a whole bunch of non-Windows devices, including a mix of Android and iOS. So if you take a look here, I have a bunch of devices with different operating systems, a good mix. I even got some Windows Mobile and Windows Phone, which is cool. To answer your question, what can you do with it? I would say, in principle, at a high level, you can do fundamentally two things. One, you can manage policies on it. So if you go to the policy node, all policies, I have a mobile security policy here. I will show you what that does. I'll give you a list of the options. So first of all, I decide, do I want to do policy enforcement, right? Do I care if a device is compliant with my policy or not, yes or no? Chances are you'll say yes. You can set a password. Is it numeric? Is it alphanumeric? Length, simple versus complex, number of failures that we'll allow, time for activity before we lock it, all that kind of stuff. Do I want to require encryption? Do I want to allow users to download email and attachments to their device? And do I want to allow a camera and a web browser? Those are the basic policies that we can manage with Intune. So what we do there is we're leveraging ActiveSync, which is already resident on those devices. So when you're doing a mobile device, you don't need an agent, which is great. All they have to do is take their device, connect it to your Exchange server, and then those ActiveSync policies will come down. But I don't have to go and configure them on the Exchange server. I can configure them here. So that's number one, basic Exchange ActiveSync policy management. And you may say, well, I have that with Exchange. What do I really get for that? So you got that, plus you get software deployment. So I can actually deploy software to... What's that? Yep. So the idea is, so the question is, outside of iTunes, what does that mean? So that methodology for deploying software to a device is called sideloading, right? It's the idea that I'm loading it outside of the consumer app store. So the scenario is this, or there's many, but this is one that I think of a lot. We want to give iPads to our users, and we want them to use it for business purposes. We built and the iPad is a great device for consumer stuff, but it doesn't really have any corporate features. So most organizations, if they want to do that, they write a corporate app. And then they say, well, now I got to get that app onto that device and make sure it's provisioned so when they bring it to work, they can use it. How do I get it there? Well, one is I could put it in the consumer app store. Most companies don't want to do that for obvious reasons. There's intellectual property. They don't necessarily want to give a royalty to a company and things like that. And they don't really want to expose that. So the way they do it is they do sideloading. They put it in here. They publish it to that self-service portal. There's a mobile equivalent of that portal, which I'll show you here. So remember I showed you before the portal for a PC? Well, there's one. It's almost the same URL. Just put an M in front of it. And I get to the mobile portal. And then when I go there, when I'm on that device, if I'm on my Android or iPad, then my software will be there, and I do a one click, and it sideloads it. So that's what it gives you. It's for delivering corporate apps to my consumer device in a self-service way. Good? That's a great question. Can you push the apps to the device? The answer is no. You cannot push an app to these devices because I do not have the ability to run in the system context on those devices. I haven't loaded an agent, and I don't have that kind of permission. And also, in most cases, these devices are not devices which I own, and therefore, again, forcing the user to load something is not really a good scenario. But I can make it available and say, you come to work, you want to be productive, here's where you go, one-stop shop, here's your software. That's right. Not possible, and it's not something... That's right. And yeah, it's not possible, and it's not really something that I get frequently asked from customers. I think if you want that kind of experience, if you want a managed software deployment experience on a consumer device, buy WinRT. That's what they're for. Shameless plug. Good question. So what happens if I'm deploying something and the connection gets broken? The answer is absolutely, absolutely. So it's a stateful deployment. If I'm midway downloading it, it gets interrupted, I disconnect, I go. If it's a huge package, that may happen. I may not have 2 hours to sit there and let the thing download. It will restart. Maybe if I download it and then I haven't done the install and I shut my machine down, when I pick it up, it's going to start that deployment. So yes, it can be interrupted and it can pick up from where it left off.
Is there any roadmap for encoding the ability to manage small environments?
Is there a roadmap for the ability to manage servers in a small environment? So the answer is, at this time, no. The position of the product group, I actually brought up this issue with them a few weeks ago and said, what's the plan for servers? Their view, and John covered this in this talk, is that Intune is meant to be a complementary solution to Config Manager. So the idea is that they recommend that you use Config Manager as your solution for managing your well-connected devices, your corporate data center, your servers, and you use Intune for managing your clients, particularly your clients that are highly mobile or that are consumer-owned and things like that, so that the two complement each other and that there is a strategy both in this release and moving forward to make those products work well together. So that is the position today. It may change, but that's currently where it is. There is no plan that I'm aware of to have Intune manage servers. But your comment is well taken. Gentleman here.
Just of the remote wipe, just to cover from the previous session, and also when the services rebuild the machine, I see that it will show up many times when you look at the licensing given those to that one client.
Yep, good question. So the question was around remote wipe and what happens if they rebuild their machine. So we do have a remote wipe feature. We have a feature where I can wipe your device, or you can wipe your own device. If it gets lost, you can go into the portal and say, oh my God, I lost my device, I want to wipe it. Okay? So as long as your device supports remote wipe, ActiveSync has an ability to send that command to the device. Okay? When you remote wipe a device, it should get retired out of the catalog and get removed. If it doesn't, for whatever reason, I haven't seen that happen, but if it did, you can forcibly remove it, and then it'll reclaim the license, so you won't have lost that license in a remote wipe scenario. So, by the way, I think we're at time, so I'm going to cut it off there. I'm happy to answer more questions. I'm happy to stick around, but I want to be mindful because we've got an hour limit. So thank you very much for coming. I hope you enjoyed the session, and I hope to see you all next year.